Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're having a good day today, and I want to welcome you to CP Talks for August. Today we have two presenters. I'm going to let them introduce themselves from UWeb. But we're going to talk about CP and coping skills today. So I'm going to let Bridget word up, introduce herself and she will guide you for today.
Thank you so much, Paul, for inviting me and my companion here, Pamela Coronado, to be a part of your series, the Michigan United Cerebral Palsy series on aging in adults with cerebral palsy. We're here today to speak to you about this thing that we call ACT, that can be used to maximize resilience and manage common challenges in cerebral palsy. And we're going to provide you with both some, personal or patient perspectives as well as provider perspectives. So my name is Bridget Waldron-Perrine. I'm a rehabilitation psychologist and a neuropsychologist at Michigan Medicine, which means that I specialize in working with people who have neurological differences. So I do not myself have cerebral palsy, but I have worked with a number of people who have cerebral palsy throughout my career, and I have found this approach to be helpful for them. I've asked Pamela Coronado to present with me, and she is an individual who does identify as an adult who is aging with cerebral palsy. So she is going to share her experience, tell you a little bit more about herself, and talk about her journey as we go forward. So I wanted to offer here a big picture definition of CP. Now, I am fully aware that I am, not in a position here to tell anyone what cerebral palsy is. This is the lived experience of people coming to this conversation today. But I wanted to highlight that cerebral palsy is very much an umbrella diagnosis. It means different things to different people. And I think it's really important to acknowledge these individual differences. And today we're going to be sharing, one person's story with cerebral palsy, but we acknowledge this isn't every person's story. So we really want to highlight this idea that everyone is different and everyone's journey, living with cerebral palsy is different. And, what it means to you is part of what your own journey is all about. So there are some common experiences that, many people with cerebral palsy have, as you all well know. And I think we really just want to highlight here too, that a lot of, the medical community, the science that's out there focuses a lot of emphasis on kids, but there's not very much on adults, and particularly related to how do we manage aging with cerebral palsy. So I want to turn it over now to Pam, to speak about her own experience in, noticing the role that cerebral palsy played in her own
life. Thank you for the invitation to share my experience with ACT, specifically relative to my CP. I was diagnosed early in my childhood with cerebral palsy. For the most part, in my mind, I grew out of most of my symptoms. And my orthopedic surgeon, who I visited 1 to 2 times a year in between my weekly PT sessions, confirmed as much when I started menstruating, with the suggestion that his work with me was done. I had continuous symptoms as an adult, pain and spasticity, for example. I usually would attribute those to just being tired and never actually in my mind to the cerebral palsy. Starting at about middle age, my symptoms started to more resemble those I had as a child. But my PCP, for the most part, attributed those changes to the fact that I was now in my 40s. After meeting with Dr. Hapala, an actual specialist in the field of adults with CP, I was introduced for the first time in my life to a better understanding of what I could expect as I age with CP. And I can share with you that my initial internal responses to her insight included denial, disbelief, grief, and all the other emotions that come along with those things. Fortunately, her introduction also included the collaboration of PTOT and the practice Dr. Waldron has shared with me, ACT.
So what is ACT, this thing that we keep referring to? ACT is a person-centered, empirically supported approach to treatment. So person-centered means it's about each unique individual, and empirically supported means there's science that supports that it is actually effective. One of the books that I often recommend to the people that I work with is called The Reality Slap. And it's this idea that when we have something very difficult, a reality slap, if you will, to navigate in our lives, there are tools that can be helpful at helping us find peace and fulfillment when life is challenging. So this is one form of ACT in a package that I often find useful to share with the people that I work with. So again, what is this thing? You may have heard of cognitive behavioral therapy as being useful for managing mental health concerns, and it has a lot of evidence and science behind it. ACT is a version of that. It's a type of cognitive behavioral therapy, but that also addresses the experience of existing as a human and what that's like for us. Notably, ACT is also been used in the business world. It's referred to as acceptance and commitment training. So it's really not just psychotherapy, it's an approach to living. So what is ACT really about? It gives us a set of skills that allows us to handle painful stuff that shows up more effectively. So we're responding to it rather than reacting to it in such a way that those experiences then have less impact and influence over our lives. So there are two major parts to this. One, we have to accept the unwanted things that we cannot control or cannot get rid of. And then we need to commit to actions towards living a valued life. And the tools that we're about to talk about will effectively help you understand how to do these things. So ACT has been put into this model that's referred to as the triflex, and there are 6 components. And I'm going to try to really simplify this, right? So if we are able to handle the curveballs that life throws at us, that's called psychological flexibility, handling the difficult stuff that inevitably is going to show up. How do we do that? Well, first, we need to know what matters and then do what matters, committing to acting on what matters. And in order to do what matters, we have to make room for the difficult thoughts and feelings that show up. We have to open up and let those experiences be what they are. And we're able to do those two things if we can be present, connect with the present moment experience, and recognize there's a part of us that can notice our experiences rather than be controlled by them. So this is all the pieces together, and it's overwhelming. But what we're going to go through here is each piece, and hopefully by the time we come to the end, you'll have a better understanding of how these pieces fit together and how they can be useful. So ACT assumes that quality in our lives is dependent upon acting on our values. And really importantly, that we can find ways to act consistently with our values regardless of our physical, cognitive, and emotional symptom load, if we learn to respond to all of our experiences with this tool called mindfulness that we will talk about. So why do we think this is appropriate for people who have CP? Well, there's a lot of evidence base in all sorts of populations who have issues like pain, neurological diagnoses, spasticity. So there's solid science that supports this should be effective. It's very able to be tailored to unique individual experiences. And it's really about a balancing of knowing what experiences to accept and where to move towards change. And it's really also focused on validating the human experience of suffering that we all have inherent in being human, and learning tools to achieve self-compassion. So again, I'll turn it over to Pam to speak to her own experience in learning more about ACT and her ACT journey.
I purchased the book that Dr. Waldron had suggested after our first conversation, but it took me a full year before I returned to her and opened the book. In my opening the book and working through the ACT process, I discovered a set of tools that assist me in changing my mindset and framework in this particular case around my experiences with CP, but I have since learned to apply it to other experiences in my life. Specific to the CP, going through the process, I've learned to accept, meaning I no longer deny the fact that I have CP, and I accept the fact that CP does in fact impact my life daily. With that acknowledgement, I am now able to reframe the tools my team has offered me, my medical team has offered me, specifically the PT, OT, and FES that I get to do, or my home exercise program, that is now going to be part of my life for the rest of my life.
So why do we get stuck in, having difficulty kind of accepting changes and challenges that we face? So the reason for this is that evolution has wired us to be on guard, vigilant for differences in between us and others, because we are, as humans, a social species, and we are wired as herd creatures. So we're wired to notice when we are different than others. It makes us feel vulnerable to rejection and vulnerable to danger. So we become hyper alert. What happens then is we get really focused on or spotlighting these issues, the gap between how we wish things were and how they are. And so it's very easy to get very stuck in that gap and have lots of thoughts and feelings show up related to the gap between how I wish things were and how they are. And there's this ongoing adjustment as things change related to our circumstances that we have to navigate and be aware of where these concerns and feelings and thoughts are coming from and what it is that we can do in response to them. So a lot of this happens because of the language of the mind. So language is very useful, but we can get really mired in it, really stuck in it, really kind of lost in our own thoughts, right? And if you think about someone entering the world as a baby, they don't have language yet. All they have is their 5 senses of experience. But as soon as we develop this internal world of language, we've all had the experience of getting lost in it. Right? And so because of language, we're stuck with our own suffering. We cannot avoid it. We can't run away like we would to the rules of the external world. If there was something threatening, we try to remove ourselves from the situation. But that doesn't work when the thing that's threatening is in our own mind. So all of our minds tend to tell us some unhelpful stories. And we want to become more aware of the nature of the unhelpful stories that our individual mind tends to share with us. So I'll turn it back over to Pam for, some of her thoughts of her unhelpful stories.
My mind was definitely stuck, perhaps based on the things I needed to survive in the role I had as a single parent, or just managing life in general. I was not prepared at all for making the changes my CP Wonder team, meaning my doctors and that team, was suggesting I had to make. However, I found myself struggling with things that used to seem not challenging at all. A day at the zoo or an amusement park, and even a task as simple as grocery shopping, walking from the parking lot into the grocery store. Among the things where my brain would get stuck would be my looking back at the times that I used to work 2 jobs and went to school at the same time. The constant mental reminder I created for myself that my family immigrated to this country to work. Certainly, those things weren't helpful in getting me unstuck, but those are things I recognized in going through this process. And the first tools of ACT that I learned to appreciate and use after actually acceptance were those that helped me tame my mind from the thoughts that kept getting me stuck. One of those tools is diffusion. And that's where you actually, rather than ruminating on the same thought over and over again, or having that thought triggered by a specific event that you're dealing with in life from one moment or one day to the next, you put a label to that thought, and then for me, I use that label. It's usually 1 or 2 words, and I would, rather than ruminate on the actual thought, use the label to replace that and say it to myself in my mind in a funny voice, in a comical voice, either a cartoon character voice or a comedian's voice, just something to serve as a positive distraction, so I wouldn't keep ruminating on the same thought. Other tools that I've used in the same regard, if I take the word or the label, I can close my eyes and imagine that I am the sky, or I am looking at the sky, and these words are in fact clouds traveling through the sky, or likewise leaves on a stream. And just in going through the process of the imagery, it calms my mind enough for me to then realize, hey, it's time for me to move on and enjoy what's in front of me instead of getting stuck in my mind, in the thoughts.
Yeah, I think those are some great examples. And as we go forward, we'll share even more specifics about those. So kind of going back to, why are things so hard sometimes? Why do we get so stuck? An important concept is to recognize where distress might be coming from, and that, those of us who have fancied themselves good problem solvers, tend to get stuck when our problem solving tools don't work, right? So what's a problem? A problem is something we don't want. And a solution is figuring out how to get rid of it or avoid it. The problem is that when we're talking about internal experiences that we actually can't avoid or get rid of, this approach doesn't work. So an alternative approach, you can't get rid of your fears, but you can learn to live with them, is really what ACT is all about. And it's really this idea that control, or efforts to control, of things that aren't controllable is actually the problem, not the solution. So a metaphor that we use for this is the metaphor of the tug of war. We're all in a tug of war with a big burly, monster of self-doubt and unworthiness and symptom experience. And we've been spending a lot of energy trying to get rid of that monster, pull him into the hole, so to speak. And, typically we're spending a lot of energy and it's not effective. And so the idea here with this tug of war is to help us kind of all understand that, we can keep standing there expending this energy, but there might be an alternative approach. And the alternative approach is to drop the rope and to stop using the energy, and to recognize this doesn't get rid of the problem, but it recovers the energy that I was uselessly spending trying to get rid of the problem. So again, I'll turn it back over to Pam and her journey of kind of realizing control, or efforts at control, to be kind of part of the problem.
Well, control is definitely something that I've always convinced myself was absolutely necessary, but the ACT process provided me with the tools to accept the invitation to surrender that control and stop resisting the facts that were related to the impact CP has in my life. Once I stopped resisting, I could then reframe my previous perception and the thoughts about my PT and OT and any other modalities. My team at my team of doctors relative to my CP offered me what I used to perceive as symbols of imperfection or weakness. I now have accepted gleefully as tools to help me become and continue to be the best version of myself.
So what Pam has really talked about here, you know, a lot of is her journey with willingness and acceptance, right? So what do these concepts mean? A way to think about this idea of willingness is kind of an analogy of chemotherapy for cancer. If someone said, you know, would you like to take a drug that is going to make you feel sick, make your hair fall out, and could possibly kill you, most people would not sign up for that. But if we frame it as such that, you know, this is the mechanism by which we save your life, then many people willingly sign up for that. So willingness is making room for things we don't want, negative experiences like unpleasant thoughts, feelings, and physical sensations, in the spirit of working to create a meaningful life. So we're not willing to experience these things just because. We're willing to experience them because it allows the end, you know, point to be possible. So acceptance is really, you know, a present moment experience. Acceptance is not about anything in the future. It's about in this moment right now, this is what I need to make room for. To be open to and allowing things I dislike or don't want, because it allows me to move towards a valued end. So acceptance is making peace and letting go of the struggle against something and embracing uncertainty. So when we talk about emotional acceptance, acceptance of the experience in the moment, we're really talking about making room for our feelings. And so in order to live by our values, we have to make room for our experiences, our physical and emotional experiences. So how do we do that? We bring awareness to the feeling in our body. We take a few deep breaths. We make room for the feelings and we allow them to be there. We may even say something like, I don't like this, but I have room for it, or it's unpleasant, but I choose to accept it. And when I say feelings, again, I just want to reiterate, I mean any emotional or physical or cognitive experience that one might naturally struggle against. We want to use expansion and make room for that experience. So we've done a lot of talking about thoughts and feelings, and we're going to talk about actions here in a few moments, but it's important to refer to this essence of usness that is the me that notices, right? This part of myself which observes my experience but is separate from it. And notably, while my thoughts and feelings have constantly changed throughout my life, there's a part of me that has been there to notice those experiences. So no matter what happens in the physical world or to my physical body, there's an essence of me-ness that is stable and unchanged and notices the experience that I have. And in many ways, that defines us. So Pam referred earlier to this metaphor, and this is one of, I think, our favorites, that really gets at this essence of, you know, I am the sky, not the clouds. I am the place where thoughts, feelings, and physical sensations happen. But just like the clouds do not define the sky, they move through it. My thoughts, feelings, and physical sensations do not define me. They're just something that I experience. So Pam will share with us a bit more now about, you know, the cultivation of her observer self perspective.
It took a while for me to get to a point of actually observing myself, so to speak, rather than just lingering on autopilot. I think in retrospect, I spent a lot of time on autopilot. And as my symptoms, the pain and spasticity in particular, increased, for a while I was still on autopilot, I was becoming actually quite cranky and yet not acknowledging it. And now in my observant self, I'm recognizing that if I happen to be in a conversation and I'm dropping F-bombs more frequently than I typically might, that's usually on account of the fact that perhaps I'm starting to get more spastic and more painful. And I obviously need to take a step back and address whatever those concerns are. Likewise, I've often in my past received feedback from others. For example, I could walk into a room and have someone ask me if everything is okay or what is wrong. More often than not, the question would be, what is wrong? And I would never quite understand it. But now I recognize that sometimes my countenance, while I think it's pretty neutral, sometimes it might look angry, just or more angry than typical, just on account of whatever spasticity I might have going on. So now I can recognize cues that remind me to not ignore the fact that I've got symptoms going on and it's time for me to do whatever I need to do, whether it's take a break or do some extra PT and OT, so that I don't end up in pain and digging myself a hole from a time management perspective or a pain management perspective that I just can't get out of.
So we've talked about acceptance. We've talked about willingness to have difficult experiences, and the mechanism by which we find the ability to do these things is mindfulness. So mindfulness has gotten a lot of hot press, in the last several years. So it might be a concept that people are somewhat familiar with. But mindfulness means paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, excuse me, and non-judgmentally. All three parts of that are actually kind of challenging to do. So I really like this image because it reminds us of, I don't know about everyone listening here, but that's what my mind looks like at any given moment. It's very jumbled up with stuff. And that's when our mind is full. And what we need to be thoughtful about is on purpose, noticing the present moment experience without judgment, much more similar to the dog in this image, who is just noticing the present moment experience without all the extra stuff. And that is being mindful. So the key concepts here are that mindfulness is not a thinking process. It's an awareness process. If you're noticing yourself thinking, you're not being mindful. Mindfulness is the noticing part. Mindfulness involves a particular attitude, one of openness to whatever your experience is, good, bad, or neutral, and curiosity, even to painful or difficult experiences. And mindfulness is really about flexibility of where you put your attentional spotlight. So mindfulness is about being able to consciously put the spotlight in one place, broaden it out, focus it in, or move it around without it getting stuck somewhere because of thoughts, feelings, or physical sensations. So some mindfulness is kind of comes in two packages. You might have heard about formal mindfulness practice or listening to like a long audio recording telling you to do some specific, noticing. But mindfulness can also be very simple. And it can be as simple as taking a few deep breaths or noticing 5 experiences of your senses around you. So these are two kind of mindfulness tools that are very simple, but can be incredibly effective. So Pam will share some of her experiences with us about using mindfulness.
I generally really appreciate and use the taking the 10 deep breaths, so much so that I have oftentimes found myself starting to take the deep breaths before even realizing that I'm starting to get into a stuck mindset, which I appreciate the cue, because more often than not, it's usually in a stressful situation or a situation where I've got different sources of stimuli coming in at the same time. So that the breathing really, really has proven helpful to me. I've also always, generally speaking, used prayer myself as a mindfulness activity. I am specifically or very much also attached to the notion of staying in the moment and anchoring in the moment. Some days my mind will start to wander, and perhaps as a subconscious form of distraction from whatever stressor, physical or otherwise, I may have. And now that I've learned the tools around mindfulness, I'm able to use them and stay in the moment. It helps me, or doing so just helps me to focus on what's important in the moment and not get tangled up in my mind and create more stress and ultimately more symptoms for myself. Much like this diagram here.
Sorry, I moved through that a little quickly if you wanted to say.
It's okay. Go right ahead.
Sorry, got an echo there. So we're now going to talk about this concept of values. Now, you've heard us kind of refer to values throughout here, but we haven't really talked about what they are. And it's a really core concept in ACT. So values are statements about what we want to be doing with our lives, what we want to stand for, and how we want to act on an ongoing basis. Values help clarify what gives our life a sense of meaning and purpose. And values are chosen life directions, kind of like a compass of where we're trying to go. So notably, values are not goals. Values are not feelings. And even values have to be held lightly to avoid getting too stuck in them. We have to be flexible with what we value, just like we have to be flexible with everything else. So values aren't something that you can achieve, but they provide direction. A goal is something that can be achieved or completed. It's an outcome in and of itself. Goals are the means to demonstrate our values. They show us that we're moving towards an unreachable end, but by achieving the goal, we show that we're living the value. So values don't always mean that our path is straight. They are not in the future, and failing to live consistently with our values all of the time is human. So when we start beating ourselves up and start lacking compassion for being perfect in living our values, we have to remember that flexibility. We defuse from that interpretation, and we use the ACT tools to provide our own self-compassion and keep trying to move in a valued direction. So this is a tool that is a list of, commonly held values that people often use to help clarify their own values. And so I'll turn it back over to Pam to speak to her experience of values clarification.
The template relative to the list of values that were included in the book was pretty extensive, and the process challenging in that regard, because it seemed like there was an awful lot to consider. But ultimately going through the process and identifying those things that were important to me, those things that I value specifically, those things by which I want to, I guess, live my life based upon, was helpful in that once I was able to determine those values, when I have been or had been faced with the challenge of taking on a new routine or changing things in the workplace for myself, for example, I was able to used the values that I ascertained were important to me as my filter and my guide. And for me in particular, I realized authenticity would be, or is at the top of my list. And when I found myself, or even still find myself, challenged by something that I have to take on account of the fact that I have CP, I simply remind myself that my response to the challenge should be, for my own sake, the most authentic response relative to who I am. And I am a person with CP and an aging adult with CP. And in my being able to filter those challenges through that value scheme, I have been able to accept the challenge and make the changes that I need to make.
So what Pam is really referring to is this kind of iterative 4-part process that keeps repeating itself endlessly. Committed action, right? Committing ourselves to our values. So how do we do this? We contact our values, we clarify them, we understand what it is that's important to us. We develop goals that feel like they'll move us in a valued direction, and then we take specific action to achieve those goals. And when stuff shows up along the way, thoughts, feelings, and physical sensations, we are willing to contact and work with those experiences, the internal and external barriers, and use our values to guide our action. And then we keep going back and repeating that process. So one way that it can be really helpful to think through these concepts is something called the willingness and action plan. And, individuals can use this as a framework for answering these specific questions, actually writing it out and having a plan for how to move forward. So noting, what is my goal? What are the actions that I can take to work towards that goal? Really importantly, what's going to show up? What's likely to show up along the way that I'm telling myself now, preemptively, I'm willing to make room for, because that goal is important enough to me that I'm willing to make room for these things. So when we acknowledge this before we get going, we don't get surprised when these things show up later on, and there's less chance that they derail us from our plan. It might be useful to remind myself of the values framework or some other component of ACT that will help me use the tools appropriately. And, sometimes we bite off, bigger bites than we can chew. Our goals are too big. They're too large. They're too all encompassing. So if we're starting to notice that feeling, this technique guides you through, okay, well, maybe I can break this goal down into smaller steps. Like, what is the smallest, easiest step I can take right now to move me towards that goal? So it feels a bit less overwhelming. And then it's about the action plan. It's about the behavior. If I said I'm going to do it, I got to commit to doing it. I got to follow it through. So what is the time, day, and date that I will take this action step? And if I can't do that, let's go back and repeat the process. What's getting in the way? Is it not the right goal? Is it not the right action step? Have I not made room for the things I need to make room for? So these questions can be really helpful in guiding us to have a concrete willingness and action plan.
And those were actually the exact steps I took around developing my home exercise program. So I was in formal PT and OT for a year. And then I was subsequently released to take on my home exercise program. And for the first year or so after that, I kind of sort of committed to it while simultaneously taking on Dr. Waldron's invitation to work with her through this ACT process. And now, having both having both gotten more comfortable with using ACT as one of my tools, and also realizing the positive outcomes relative to actually doing my home exercise program the way it was set up for me relative to my symptoms with CP. I have been able to commit to making my home exercise program part of my life on a daily basis. So much so to the extent that, fortunately, I'm able to do so, but being flexible around my daily schedule in terms of the absolute commitment to get my home exercises done. Being able to use ACT as the guide and the tool to establish that commitment for myself has been life-changing. I don't know, had I not been able to get to a point of openness, willingness, and acceptance of the impact CP has on my life, and then likewise, the wonderful tools that my medical providers have afforded me through the use of my home exercise program, and then in fact, acknowledging for myself the notion that I do need to make changes and commit to my home exercise program. I certainly would not be able to perhaps even have made time to participate in this group today on account of my symptoms with CP.
So, you know, really it's putting all the pieces together. If we know what we value, we commit to acting on those values. We make room for all the stuff that shows up, but we can learn to recognize it doesn't control us. And then, you know, really asking ourselves, using the values as the framework, is this thought that just showed up that I'm tuning into, is it useful? Forget if it's accurate or not, but is it helping me move towards my values? And then making room for all the stuff that shows up so that we can keep moving towards our values. So I'm not sure if people who are attending are able to ask us questions, but we are certainly happy to entertain any questions. You know, Paul, I don't know if you have any questions also, or if attendees are able to ask us questions in the chat, but we certainly have some additional time. And I know that both Pam and I would, you know, be happy to share more, make any clarifications. Let us know.
Thank you for your information. That's very informative. I'm gonna open up even if you don't want to ask the question, you can put it in the chat box. Because I want to know from Pamela the before and after. What is significant from the beginning to now?
Well, in the beginning, for starters, I was in absolute denial. And relative to my symptoms, and likewise, relative to the impact my symptoms were having on who I was as an individual, both personally and in the workplace. And the idea that I would get to, now it's get to, but back then it was have to go back to doing my PT and my home exercise program, much like when I was a child, what was emotionally challenging for me. I I felt as if I was regressing, and oftentimes took on feelings about perhaps having failed. The notion that maybe if I would have done more in between that time frame from when my doctor released me when I was a young teenager to now I'm middle-aged and I'm experiencing these symptoms, perhaps I would have failed. And before, that was the mindset I was caught up in, and unable and unwilling to make any changes, much less take on my home exercise program. The after is I realized how very blessed I am, one, for my team at U of M around the treatment that I've received, because I am an adult with cerebral palsy. And likewise, I can confirm for you with gratitude that when I do my home exercise program, my symptoms are manageable. And I would have never gotten to that point had I not been able to change my mindset around that.
Thank you. Any last comments from either of you? I don't see any questions in the
I'm
chat.
just, I'm just really grateful for the opportunity. And if anyone would find it helpful to have my contact information or copies of the slides, I'm happy to make sure Paul has that. I do this because I really believe in this stuff. I think it's really useful. And so I like to spread it around. And if it isn't making sense, or you're like, I don't know, I don't buy it, like, I'd love to have that conversation. So I'm happy to have additional, chats about this or provide additional resources as needed.
This is being recorded. It will be on YouTube if anyone wants to go back and review it on my UCP channel.
Well, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Thank you both, Pamela and Bruce. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your information.
Thank you for the opportunity.
I'm going to wrap up a little bit early. The next one will be September 22nd at 12 o'clock. I apologize, I don't have a topic at the moment, but if you're on my email blast, you will see a topic in about a week. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Have a good day.
You too.
Be well. Bye.